is a 2004 Lexus IS300 SportCross, and it's a very interesting car. This is the only real wagon that Lexus ever made, but most people have forgotten about it, even though it was rear-wheel drive and it uses the 2JZ 6-cylinder engine from the famous Mark IV Toyota Supra. Today, I'm going to review the IS300 SportCross, and we're going to remember, and I'm going to show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this IS300 SportCross is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a two-owner car with less than 60,000 miles and service records going all the way back to new, and it's always been out here in the West, and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this IS300 SportCross, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the IS300 SportCross, and I'm going to start with a general overview of this car because frankly, its mere existence is quite a quirk. So, it's the late 1990s and Lexus has been a very successful brand. They're closing out their first decade, they've had great profits and great sales, but they've noticed that their customers in general are a little on the older side, and Lexus decides they want to spice things up. They want to go sportier and get a more youthful customer. And to do that, they wanted to go after what at the time was basically the sportiest luxury car, the BMW 3 Series. So, for the 2001 model year, Lexus debuted the IS300, which was a compact rear-wheel drive luxury sports sedan following the exact formula of the BMW 3 Series. Now, here in the States, this was the Lexus IS300, but overseas, they sold it as the Toyota Altezza. They just brought it here and made it more luxury to compete with BMW. Now, also at the time, the BMW 3 Series lineup included a station wagon version, and so Lexus must have figured if we're gonna compete, we might as well compete all the way. And so a couple of years after the IS debuted, they came out with a station wagon version. That was this, the IS300 SportCross, which was sold overseas as the Toyota Altezza Gita, and that was the wagon version of the Lexus IS. Sales were not strong. In fact, during the few years that the SportCross was available, Lexus only managed to sell a little over 3,000 of these in the United States, which makes the IS300 SportCross rarer here than the 2005 Ford GT. They just didn't do that well with this car, and when the second-gen Lexus IS came out for 2006, a wagon was nowhere to be found. In fact, this was the first, last, and only station wagon that Lexus has ever offered. Now, a few years later, they tried again with a hybrid hatchback called the CT200H, but that also failed, and they haven't tried a hatchback again since either. But in the years since the SportCross went out of production, it's attained something of a cult status among car enthusiasts, in part because it's a rare wagon, which enthusiasts love, but also due to the drivetrain. These SportCrosses all had a 2JZ 3-liter 6-cylinder engine, the same powertrain found in the famed Toyota Supra, the Mark IV. Now, in this car, you only had the 2JZ GE, which was the naturally aspirated non-turbo version. It made 215 horsepower, but there were so many performance parts and extras and modifications you could do to a 2JZ that you can really tune the IS300 up and get some big power out of it, and relatively reliably to make for a pretty fast wagon. It also helped that all of these SportCrosses were rear-wheel drive. So you had a rear-wheel drive platform and a very tunable engine, and thus enthusiast interest was piqued. And these were also pretty small and relatively light. The Wagon version of the IS300 added 125 pounds compared to the sedan, but even then it only weighed in around 3,400 pounds, which just isn't really all that heavy. At only 173.8 inches long, these cars were shorter in length than an E46 BMW M3, despite being a station wagon, while those cars were all two doors. And that small size also made it impressive. The drawback, unfortunately, was the transmission. All IS300 SportCross models came with a 5-speed automatic. Lexus did offer a manual in the IS300 sedan, but never in the wagons. These were, unfortunately, auto only. The result was a 0 to 60 time in the mid 7-second range, which isn't really all that fast, but you could tune it, and people did. Much more power from the engine. A lot of these have manual transmission swaps. This particular one is tremendously clean, almost entirely stock, in really nice shape, so it hasn't been tuned for more power, but it would be a pretty nice starting point if you wanted to make a good SportCross into a truly impressive high-performance sleeper. But anyway, next up, let's climb inside the SportCross and talk interior quirks and features. There are surprisingly quite a few, starting with the seats, which have Alcantara inserts on the backrest and on the seat bottom. These days, Alcantara is pretty common to see in a lot of cars, but back in the early 2000s, it really wasn't, and yet this car had it. It felt cool and sporty. Same deal on the door panel. You can see Alcantara trim on the upper half. It looks luxurious, like you wouldn't expect from a car at this price point. But in terms of cool interior stuff, I particularly loved the gear lever situation in this car. So Lexus knew that a lot of people buying these would want to feel sporty and cool, but realistically, they would probably want an automatic transmission. People buying a brand new Lexus Wagon weren't really shift your own gear people, but they kind of thought they wanted to be. So Lexus made the automatic shift lever look like a manual shift lever. You can see it's this ball on the top and just a little stick coming out like a manual gear lever would be, and then you would move it between gears, except as an automatic, PR and D, instead of shifting the gears. You had basically a manual shift lever. There wasn't even a button to push to move between gears, but it was an automatic shift lever instead. I've always found this funny, like Lexus wanted to give a consolation prize to people who didn't get a manual transmission, and I must say that shifting this between gears is the most satisfying automatic transmission shifter in the entire car industry ever. It really does feel good putting it PR and D, but it's ultimately still an automatic. Now, it's also worth pointing out in this gear pattern, you can see that next to D is M, which stood for manual mode, but there's no like plus or minus in the gear lever area where you could shift. That's because they did it on the steering wheel. You had a downshift button, as you can see right here, and you had one over on the other side of the steering wheel as well. So two downshift buttons facing you. And then in the back of the steering wheel, you had an upshift button that you could push if you wanted to upshift. And that was true over on the other side also. So this was the days before paddles. Automakers were still figuring out exactly how people wanted to manually shift their automatic transmissions. And in this car's case, it was up and downshift buttons on both sides of the steering wheel. Definitely unusual by modern standards. Now, the thing that I especially love in this interior, and the thing that this car gets the most praise for inside, is the gauge cluster, which truly looks beautiful. I have always loved the way this looks, and everybody gave this car praise for this gorgeous, almost high-quality wristwatch styled gauge cluster that truly looked fantastic then and has aged beautifully ever since. This has to be one of the nicest looking gauge clusters in any sort of mainstream modern car. It's really wonderful. But anyway, moving on to the other interior quirks and features. For one, the driver's seat had memory settings, but they were almost hidden. You had to look to the left of the steering wheel, and then it was these tiny little buttons that you could program for seat memory if you wanted to, an unusual out-of-the-way spot for that feature in this car. Next up, another interesting quirk came at the top of the dashboard in the center. You had this little panel here, the latch. You could open it up, and it was a little extra storage compartment. You might be wondering why they did that. Well, that's because this car offered an optional navigation system, and it would pop out from that exact location, and then it would be popped up and facing you, and you could use it for navigation. Now, obviously, these days, nobody wants anything to do with that ridiculous 20-year-old navigation system, but it was a big deal at the time, an optional extra. And if you didn't get it, you instead got this little storage compartment as kind of a consolation prize. Next up, another interesting item in this interior, you have a traction control off button. You can see here at the bottom of the center control stack, and just a little bit below that you have a button marked power. You can press for more power after you turn the traction control off in case you really want to get wild in your Lexus station wagon. Actually, the Sporty touches in here went pretty far. In addition to the Alcantara and the fake manual gear selector and those cool gauges, you also had some nice aluminum touches, particularly the pedals, which I've always felt looked really good. High quality and very performance car. You saw a similar thing on the door sill. You can see, open the door, it doesn't say Lexus or IS, but it does give you this aluminum look with these black dots in between, which kind of projected an air of high quality and sportiness. I think it still looks good today. Now, aside from that stuff, the rest of this interior is, well, pretty early 2000s Lexus, which is to say fairly basic, fairly straightforward, fairly clear what all the climate controls do, what all the stereo controls do. No weird swoops or aggressive risks in this interior. They went far enough with the Alcantara and the gear selector and the gauge cluster. Everything else was fairly muted, fairly toned down, like you would expect from a Lexus from this era. But anyway, next we move into the back seat of the SportCross, which is, well, actually pretty tight. This is not a tremendously large back seat, and frankly, you weren't really expecting it. This car only being 174 inches long, it wasn't going to have a huge back seat. Even though it's a wagon, it was a sport wagon, and so the back seats were a little tight to keep the car small, to make sure it stayed sporty. Now, here in back, there's not that many interesting things, but a few items worth pointing out. One, the seat centers remain Alcantara, so you had that nice luxury sport detail carried over to the back, and same deal on the rear doors. You had that Alcantara trim back here as well. Lexus didn't cheap out and just stick it on the front doors. They put it in back also. And speaking of the nice trim, same deal on the door sill. You had that aluminum trim with the little black dots, just like you did up front. Again, Lexus didn't cheap out. It looked nice back here. As for comfort, I already said it was tight, but it was especially tight for the middle seat. There is technically a middle seat here with a seat belt, but the hump in the center made it basically impossible for that person to put their feet anywhere. And of course, it was already fairly small before that, so not exactly a comfortable car seating 5. Now, in the middle, you do have these pull-out cup holders, as you can see. You can pull them out, and then rear passengers can stick their drinks there, although they're not particularly large, and they don't look very trustworthy, but they're there. This actually continues a theme, because up front, you also had cup holders that were also fairly small, but again, they were there, better than no cup holders at all. Now, one especially interesting thing that's accessible from the back, you're back here and you look at the backs of the front seats, you can see the driver's seat is leather with a little storage pocket, but the passenger seat has this hard plastic back, and that's because the passenger seat can fold all the way down. You pull on this little latch, and then you fold it down, and then you can use it as a table if you want to. If you're in the driver's seat and you're trying to write notes or use a laptop or have a quick lunch, you fold down the passenger seat and it becomes a table, which is a pretty cool feature that frankly I wish more cars had. It's also especially useful in this wagon because you have the extra cargo area. Of course, you can fold down the back seats, and then you can fold down the front seat if you have some especially long item that you need to transport. The wagon adds practicality, and this fold down front seat added, well, even more practicality. And next we move around back in the SportCross where we can see the taillights. Ah, these world famous taillights. If you grew up in this era, you know exactly what I'm going to talk about. So, before this car came out, most vehicles had their red taillights in a red housing. That was the normal way to do it, and everyone did. But Toyota decided to just make the area with the light red, and everything else would be clear. It was a new idea, a new design, and people became obsessed. This taillight housing design became one of the biggest fads in the car industry in the late 90s and early 2000s. Everybody called them Altezzas, Altezza Taillights, because they originally debuted on the foreign market Toyota Altezza. It was a testament to just how popular they were that people called them Altezzas when Toyota didn't even sell the Altezza in the United States. But everybody knew and everybody wanted these lights, and every aftermarket manufacturer created knockoff Altezza taillights for basically every vehicle in existence, from Hondas to Ford pickup trucks, and you could stick them on your car and look like the Altezza. And it all started right here, the famous Altezza taillights. Now, one thing people don't talk about with the brake lights in this car that's also kind of unusual is there were brake lights on the hatchback, on the inside of the actual brake lights. These did not have to be here. There was no government mandate, but Lexus stuck them here and they turn on when you put on the brakes. You can see they actually work. I've never been entirely clear why Lexus did this, but interestingly, they also did it on their GS sedan at this time. It also had sort of these trunk-mounted brake lights that would turn on. Again, not required, they just chose to do it. I'm not sure if they were trying to maybe make it become like a Lexus hallmark, but it didn't really get far past these cars. They dropped it, and this car has it. It's weird. And the final thing we have to cover with the IS300 SportCross is, of course, the cargo area. This is a wagon, so we have to cover the wagonness. Now, it's not huge back here, but it's decent sized. It certainly added some practicality to the sedan. You had a good bit of space back here where you could get some more items and storage inside your IS300, but still enjoy its sporty rear-wheel drive charm. A couple of interesting things in back. For one, there's speakers back here. You can see they are branded Lexus. Lexus speakers in the back, which is kind of unusual. But the cool part is the cargo cover. Check this out. You pull the cargo cover closed and it would be covering up those speakers, but look, there are holes in the cargo cover that perfectly correspond to the location of the speakers. So even if you have the cargo cover closed, you're driving around, you can still hear your music from all possible speakers because of these thoughtful cargo cover holes, which is a neat idea that I've never seen before. Now, aside from that, these Lexus branded speakers back here, there are some other Lexus items. For instance, this Lexus branded cargo net. As you can see, not just a regular cargo net, a Lexus one, and a Lexus branded first aid kit. Not just a regular first aid kit, but a Lexus one. Of course, you also have a Lexus branded mat on the cargo floor. Whoever bought this car knew really went all out at the Lexus accessories catalog to make sure everything was Lexus, Lexus, Lexus. By the way, one other nice touch in the cargo area of the SportCross, you have a little light back here, and it doesn't just come on when you open up the tailgate. Instead, you can switch it on. So if you're rooting around in your back trying to find something, you can turn on your light, and it will make your life a little easier. A nice touch from the days before everybody had a cell phone flashlight in their pocket. All right, driving the IS300 SportCross. Believe it or not, I have never driven a Lexus IS300 of any variety. The 2JZ powered first generation model, which went, I think, like 01 to 05. So here I am in the SportCross. So my first impression of this car is that the handling is impressively tight. The suspension is great. The owner of this car told me that he added sway bars, but it's also just like, the car only has 59,000 miles. It's little, and that was a positive that a lot of people said about it at the time. It changed direction quickly and it feels good. There is not all that much body roll, and I'm actually surprised by it, but the car handles kind of on the level of BMW and other performance cars from this era that I drive. I'm really impressed by that aspect of it. It just feels like tight and like quick to change direction in a way that I wasn't really expecting. Now that could be a lot of just expectations based, because you always kind of think, oh, Lexus isn't gonna measure up. But regardless, I'm really truly surprised by just how quickly the car changes directions, how fast it is to kind of move from lane to lane or around a curvy road. The steering could be better. It's a little bit vague. You go to turn it and you have to wait a little bit for something to happen. I mean, looking at this car from a modern lens, that's just sort of the reality of the situation. All of these cars from the late 90s, early 2000s, although they had their wonderful hydraulic steering feel, they just aren't as precise as modern cars, where automakers are really tuning into the fact that people want like quick turns of the wheel to do something immediately. And back then, I mean, I'm here turning the wheel, you know, an inch or two in each direction and not much happens. That doesn't occur anymore. Now, another culprit, and I think making this car feel like it handles fantastically, is the size. It's just so little. And so, yeah, there's not much body roll, but there's also not much body to roll. This car's only 3,400 pounds, 174 inches long. This is the size of sports sedan that I love. Like, this is the perfect size for a sports sedan, in my opinion, and, you know, or in this case, a tiny sport wagon. And it just feels so sporty and capable when you start to throw it around because of that. But on from steering and handling, a couple of other interesting things. Number one, the car is slow. I mean, it just is. 0 to 60 in the mid 7s. It's quicker than I was expecting given that number, but it doesn't feel fast. This isn't like a fast performance car that you're really floored and you're going somewhere. I think in order to really exploit this car's performance potential, you would have to tune it up. Fortunately, that's very easy to do, but then maybe you lose some of the character of the car, some of the quietness, all that. But regardless, it wasn't that fast from the factory. 215 horsepower with an automatic only. Even though this was intended to compete with the 3 Series at the time, the 330i had more power. It was at 225, and of course you could get a manual. And back then, manuals were a lot quicker than automatics. And so this car was always kind of a little dulled compared to that, and the Wagon is even a little bit slower. It's not terrible, but it's not exactly tremendously fast. One thing I really like about this car is just excellent quality. The interior is not like tremendously nice. Like, there's not a lot of like beautiful materials, whatever, although Alcantara is surprising to see. But it's not like tremendously high quality beautiful. But what you do have in here is like there's no rattling, nothing is broken, every button and switch works, even though this car is 20 years old, no plastic is falling apart. Like, this is what people expect when they think about Toyota quality. They don't think about the top quality materials, but they think about stuff that is built to last. Truthfully, I've been driving this car around for the whole morning, and I'm kind of impressed with it. I'm a little smitten. It's a little bit slow, and the steering is a little bit slow to react, but when it does start to react, it does give pretty good precision through corners, and the handling is great. With that said, I think this car with a manual swap would be really a lot more fun. It would probably shave a half second off the 0 to 60, and it would really open things up a little bit to be more enjoyable. And I think this car with about 70 more horsepower would really be a lot of fun. And I think if you did those two things, this would be like one of the coolest Japanese cars from this era. It's fun to drive as a base case car, but you could do a little bit more to make it like really fun. And that would be cool. And so that's the Lexus IS300 SportCross. This is an interesting car, and frankly, I've always liked these. I wish they had sold them with 3 pedals, but even as an automatic, this is pretty cool. It's right-sized, it drives well, it's tight, it's surprisingly fun, and it's definitely interesting. And this one can be yours on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the IS300 SportCross a DougScore.
And the DougScore is here, 46 out of 100, which places the IS300 SportCross here against some sorta similar cars. The original IS300 was a cool car, and the Wagon is even cooler and much rarer. It's not incredibly fast by modern standards, but it's fun and weird, and I always love that, and it's also a pretty good bargain. If you're looking for something reliable and reasonably practical and more interesting than a typical compact crossover, well, there's this.